Hello, my Darksiders, my minions of doom, my apocalyptic bringers of terror, my legions of orcs and demons, and other foul creatures of the abyss. It is I, your Dark Lord, Kroski von Kronos, and I'm here today to give to you the next episode in the villain competency tier list. This time, we're going to be going over the primary antagonist from the Call of Duty Modern Warfare franchise and the main antagonist from the first Call of Duty Modern Warfare game, Imran Zakhaev. This is an entry that I've been wanting to do for quite some time on this channel, especially since I feel like compared to the other prominent Call of Duty villains, General Shepard, Vladimir Makarov, Raul Menendez, of course I will be giving those guys and more Call of Duty villains entries on this tier list, for sure. But I wanted to go over Imran first because I felt like his contributions to the franchise and the storytelling capabilities of Modern Warfare are very underrated. I mean, this guy is the progenitor of basically every bad thing that happens in the Modern Warfare series. He is a shadowy manipulator, one of the four horsemen and the group's leader, who is behind a litany of horrible atrocities and attacks on the Western world. And also on his own homeland of Russia, he is responsible for a series of terrorist activities. He's the he is the sensei, the teacher to Vladimir Makarov, the one who kind of grew, who nurtured and grew his hatred of the West, the one who is behind much of the series events, also because he founded the ultranationalist political party. And in general, he's just a nasty guy with a bone to pick against the West. So before we get into the competency levels of Imran Zakhaev and how he squares up on this list in comparison to other entries, and of course in his own general overview of my own general overview of his competency, we should go over a bit of the historical background that Imran Zakhaev comes from, because similar to other villains on this list, Zakhaev is inspired by a lot of real world events and political ideologies to a point, actually, where he is just a fictional character that could seriously exist in our world today, or perhaps exist 10 years ago during the heyday of Russia, considering the actual, like, events that took place in our world that have led to the creation of someone as monstrous, ruthless, and determined as him. So, what do I mean by that? Well, for starters, Zakhaev comes from the Soviet Union, not from Russia. I think that's a very important distinction to make because the Soviet Union was essentially Russia at its highest form of power. Of course, it was officially a collection of communist and socialist territories aligned against the greedy capitalists of the West and determined to liberate every nation on earth and bring it into a worldwide revolution, as outlined by Lenin and Marx long ago. However, the Soviet Union was, in fact, plagued by a lot of internal difficulties and tribulations. There was a lot of corruption from every level, from local to the highest cabinet ministers. There was a lot of bureaucracy that ensured practically nothing got done. And on top of all of that, there were numerous political separatist movements taking place in SSR, and Soviet satellite states, Belarus, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Dagestan, etc., Kyrgyzstan, etc., and of course Ukraine, which is a big one. And all of these issues were creating a boiling point for the Soviet Union. It was slow for sure. It was unnoticeable at first, especially since the Soviet Union was more preoccupied attempting to dethrone the United States of America and its NATO allies as the predominant world power through the Cold War. The Cold War was not necessarily an open conflict fought between the two superpowers, but rather a series of proxy wars and shadow conflicts taking place throughout the world in which the Soviet Union backed certain factions located in countries across the planet, namely the North Vietnamese in Vietnam, and the and numerous communist forces throughout South America and Latin America. Cuba comes to mind. The reign of the Castro, reign of Fidel Castro, was heavily backed by the Soviet Union at the time. And in fact, the Soviets were often pointing to Cuba as a pristine example of communist success in the world today to disprove the capitalist ideology. So, of course, the Soviet Union were very preoccupied with the Cold War, and perhaps to a detrimental point, because despite the fact that Comrade Stalin and his reign of open terror had been ended, the fact of the matter remained that much of the Soviet Union existed in a state of perpetual internal decay because of the sheer fact that communism itself is an ideology that invasively corrodes society from within, considering that many of its economic and political policies are pursuing just generally nothing more than mediocrity, and they often lead to backwards philosophies being implemented into local leaders and government officials who then don't really want to take any action when issues such as when issues of infrastructure, food shortages, et cetera, begin arising. So with that little tidbit, that little history lesson aside, Zakhaev was not likely. He was definitely growing up inside this environment, but he wasn't really exposed to much of the Soviet Union's faults. It was highly likely that he was born into a very embedded Soviet family, perhaps a family of military elitists who distinguished themselves in World War II against the Nazis. For sure, whatever the case, he himself was a very prominent figure throughout Soviet society, and especially within the higher circles of power inside the Kremlin at Moscow, considering that in the Call of Duty games, we see him take a predominant role within the games when it's suspected that a Soviet spy in reality sent by the CIA to garner intelligence on the Soviet KGB, which was the Soviet Union's intelligence agency, their version of the CIA essentially. And they primarily handled internal dissidents, but were often involved in foreign operations as well. So Zakhaev was sent to unearth the mole, where he encountered Adler and Bell, presumably from the Call of Duty reboot timeline. I'm doing a bit of melding when it comes to Zakhaev's story because I know that he exists in both the original Call of Duty Modern Warfare and in the reboot timeline, and the reboot timeline doesn't it does contradict heavily with the modern timeline, but like past the events that take place in the past of it, like Zakhaev's time in the Soviet Union as a KG, as a presumably a high ranking official and an investigator working to unearth the mole in the KGB, doesn't really have to be discounted. That could easily work as well with the overview I'm doing of the original timeline Zakhaev. So, just getting that out there. Regardless, Zakhaev was a very prominent and well-to-do individual, and this translated into his son Viktor Zakhaev, who was alive during his childhood to witness the heyday of the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, all good or likely bad things come to an end, and Premier Mikhail Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, installed a bunch of bureaucratic reforms meant to bring about an age of liberalization. So the Soviet Union, the United Soviet Socialist Republics, could compete with Western nations in terms of technology, innovation, and the ability to keep up in infrastructure and generally just become power to compete against the West, not just militarily but also societally. However, these reforms had the opposite intended effect. Instead of bolstering the Soviet Union, they led directly to its collapse because it allowed numerous political criticisms and desires of independence from Soviet satellite states to emerge that hadn't beforehand. It led to the collapse of the Berlin Wall. It led to the liberation of numerous countries and riots in several others. The Soviet satellite states, especially within the Baltics, were experiencing uprisings and political upheavals like they never had before. And wouldn't you know it, within the decade, the Soviet Union was all but a memory. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned in disgrace after a failed coup by communist hardliners against his disastrous leadership, at least for the Soviet Union, and actually, at least for Russia, because for the most part, the other actual members of the Soviet Union were very happy about his disastrous leadership. But whatever the case, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union is now just something to read about in the history books. However, for some, the organization has never really died. The organization lives on in their hearts and minds. The prosperity it brought to Russia, at least to their eyes, was something that could never be replicated and was something that needed to be brought back at all costs. Even though they believed that it could never be truly brought back, they could still bring about a modicum of the prosperity that the Soviet Union brought to Russia by reacquiring some stole from what they believed are stolen territories and landscapes thieved from them by the liberalizations and the political resistances that had formed throughout Eastern Europe and Central Asia against them. Zakhaev was, of course, in this class of people. He never really saw the flaws of the Soviet Union, or if he did, he likely blamed them on Western interferences. And he was definitely a grizzled old veteran of some kind. I believe this is just a headcanon, but I believe Zakhaev was likely a KGB intermediary in conflict zones such as Vietnam and in conflict zones within South America and conflict zones within Africa, especially in Angola, where there was a lot of communist rebellion going on at the time, heavily funded by the Soviet Union. and he had seen his fair share of conflict, bloodshed, and war, and he believed it all necessary to ensure the prosperity, security, and survival of his homeland. Once he saw how the Soviet Union was essentially carved up and Russia itself poured out to the highest bidding oligarchs and privatization specialists, the people who were just gobbling up all this infrastructure and all these economic resources and natural resources, and generally just the labor of the Russian people in this capitalist frenzy, this like vile to him, disgusting like blood feeding of sharks onto the corpse, the cadaver of what was once a prosperous, righteous country. It drove Zakhaev into a state of madness and rage. He believes that the modern Russian government and its supporters and enablers have allowed the West to take advantage of them through the encroaching devilishness of capitalism and now have become lesser for it. Zakhaev is determined to bring Russia back to its glory state at any cost. Even if he cannot fully resuscitate the Soviet Union, he'll damn well try. And that's what brings us to Call of Duty today. Throughout the Call of Duty games, Zakhaev is more of an omnipresent, detached present presence, if that makes any sense. An omnipresent, detached presence. What do I mean by that? Well, he's only directly involved in the first Call of Duty game, where we see him take a role against Captain Price and his SAS squad, determined to bring about an age of Russian neo-Soviet ideology by founding the ultranationalist political party and constantly being at odds with Captain Price and the SAS, Britain and America alike, by fomenting a series of terrorist attacks both within Russia to cause instability to allow the ultranationalists to begin their plans of securing the country for themselves, and by forming an alliance called the Four Horsemen. Well, I mean, I don't know if he called it the Four Horsemen, but they were designated as the Four Horsemen by American intelligence throughout the games. The Four Horsemen were comprised of Imran, his son Viktor, Khaled, Al-Asad, and presumably a fourth unknown member who is revealed to be Vladimir Makarov. The Four Horsemen were essentially determined to change the world order radically to ensure that Russia and the Middle East became dominant over the Western powers at any cost. Zakhaev used his experience of political subterfuge alongside his status as a former Cold War hero and Soviet general to access a lot of secret resources that were not available to many even within the Soviet Union. Like Zakhaev had access to a whole bunch of crazy shit. He had access to nuclear rods, depleted uranium, munitions, connections, old friends, and favors to call upon within the Kremlin that were still in operation by the time he decided to begin the ultranationalists. I mean, Sakayev had it all. And he had it all because he was very good at one thing, bringing people together. Zakhaev himself, by the time we see him in the story, isn't much of a direct leader. You know, he's an old man with a gun who is very admirable and noble in leading his troops from the front, but despite all this, he's not as much of a terrifying, imposing presence directly as I'd say Vladimir Makarov. His real power comes from his ability to stay in the sidelines, stay in the shadows, and bring people together under the common cause of mutual benefit, which I believe he succeeded greatly in doing when he forged the alliance with Khaled al-Assad, the Arabian dictator and the secondary antagonist of the Call of Duty Modern Warfare game. So, where does Zakhaev directly land on the competency tier list? Well, honestly, pretty high, I'd say. In my opinion, there's not much that discounts Zakhaev from being a competent leader. You could argue that in the final Modern Warfare game, after the death of his son, which was not really his fault, but more his son's own undoing, because his son was a very reckless and foolish individual from the get-go, and so his demise was likely to be expected when you placed him in charge of a paramilitary organization. I guess Zakhaev not considering that might detract his competency a little. I don't really think it does. It's a really minor detail and nothing to really, agonize over. But after his son dies, he kind of just goes on this rampage and is determined to bring about an age of Russian glory, no matter the cost. So he secures a bunch of ICBMs and aims them at the western seaboard of America, which I don't really think he's thought about the consequences of that very much. He's mostly acting in fury because his son is dead. But I mean, if he launched those nukes, that would result in a nuclear holocaust that would also bring about the fiery destruction of the homeland he so loves and adores. So obviously, Zakhaev gave into his madness a bit at the end, and of course, that resulted in his own demise when Soap McTavish cleaved his head open with a bullet. So That is a bit harmful against his competency for sure, but we should also look at what Zakaya managed to achieve. Throughout the Modern Warfare franchise, his influence is undeniable. I mean, he creates the Ultranationalist Party, which Makarov later inherits an even more extremist wing of, and Makarov cites Zakayev as his inspiration and wants to purge the Ultranationalist Party of non-believers that are detract or otherwise distance themselves from Zakayev's platform and try to bring Russia into a moderate state of peace with the West. He does not like Makarov does not like that at all. That's all because of what Zakayev implemented into him from a very young age. Makarov saved his life when he was almost assassinated by Captain Price in Pripyat, Chernobyl, and from that day forward, Zakayev tended to Makarov as sort of his protege. And of course, there was Yuri, but Yuri is not as important, especially considering he betrays Makarov later on and was always a bit shaky about the ultranationalist cause. So I don't really mention him as much. Plus, he becomes a good guy. So I mean, yeah. But yeah. Anyway, so Zakayev's influence is felt in that way, and indirectly because the ultranationalists were responsible for the bombing through a nuclear device of Khaled al-Assad's capital city, which results in General Shepard's own turn to madness and his betrayal of Task Force 141, essentially setting into stage the second half of Modern Warfare 2. So Zakhaev is one of those people whose actions are reverberating long after his own demise. What he set into motion will continue unperturbed for decades after he's dead, and for decades after even his protege Makarov has died. Because, I mean, he indirectly starts World War III by creating the political party and militaristic faction responsible for igniting it, Makarov's forces, of course, the Inner Circle as they're called in the later Modern Warfare games. Even after Russia forges a peace with the West, I mean, tensions will still remain high. There's a catastrophic death toll, and for a brief time, at least in the games, obviously the realism kind of veers off here because I don't know if the Russian Federation would actually be capable of doing this in real life. But they did conquer much of Europe. Their tanks managed to reach Paris, and they were invading Germany during Modern Warfare 3. So they nearly did establish the ideal neo-Soviet empire they were dreaming of, with Makarov installed as its visionary. I'm sure Zakhaev, if he were still alive, would have had the throne, but of course he was dead by that time. But his dream lived on through his protege. So Zakhaev combined all that with the fact that Zakhaev was able to form the Ultranationalist Party through the connections and through the ascensions he made during his time in the Soviet Union, during his time as a young man with idealistic beliefs in Russia's greatness over all the world, the Soviet Union bringing an age of prosperity that was never before seen to humankind, his genuine belief that socialism and communism were the natural evolutions of the human economic state, and that through collectivism and through working together, everyone would be uplifted rather than just a privileged few, as he believes American capitalism does. And through and a believer, a genuine believer in the cause, who actually manages to further his cause, that's a pretty big upgrade on a competency level. I mean, I know there's a lot of villains in this, mainly Palpatine, who don't actually believe in anything besides their own ascension. Whereas Zakhaev has a genuine belief and he has genuine family ties and bonds, and he is capable of forging alliances and partnerships, unlike Palpatine, who just wants to control everyone and everything. However, you gotta realize also that even though he is kind of held back by these constraints, that Zakhaev is still a man who managed to bring about so much destruction, so much chaos, and placed Russia on an elevated position that he did ultimately achieve some of his long term goals. I mean, no matter the ruined state Russia is in after the war, the fact still remains that it did manage to conquer much of Europe until at least America tried to, well, not tried to, they did succeed in liberating the European peoples from the Russian grasp. But at least for a while, for a brief while, Russia was ascendant. And that was all because of Zakhaev's work in grooming Makarov and creating the Ultranationalist Party and in his determination to revive the Soviet Union. Again, and of course, again, villain competency is based on how close they were to achieving their own personal goals, and Zakhaev literally did achieve his own goals. The only reason why he's not going to be at the top of this list, like at the very top of this list, is because he just didn't manage to achieve something on the same scale as an intergalactic organization like Palpatine's Galactic Empire. But the fact of the matter remains that he did actually achieve his goal. Makarov did coup Boris Vershevsky and bring the extremist ultranationalist faction back into the mainstream, and nearly did succeed in turning Europe into either subjugated territory of the Russian Federation or outright nuclear hellfire as retribution for them resisting their Russian overlords. You know, and of course, and of course, the Russians did invade New York after Makarov's massacre in the airport. So, I mean, you got to give him props for that too, because Zakhaev taught Makarov everything he knew about the arts of terrorism, about the arts of sowing fear and chaos into a population, and generally just creating enough instability so that someone can take advantage and step in as the leader and provide an era of iron-fisted tyranny that and convinces the people they need this iron-fisted tyranny to survive against external enemies and internal enemies. So with that out of the way, the grizzled old war veteran Imran Zakhaev, founder of the modern ultranationalist party and a major threat in the Call of Duty franchise, even if he was only present for one of the games, will be receiving the rank of if plot armor didn't exist, they'd rule the universe. Because frankly, it took the plot armor of beloved Call of Duty characters like Captain Price and Soap McTavish and Gaz and Griggs and all of the others to take him down. Fervently believe if they weren't in the equation and if Viktor had never died, Zakhaev would have succeeded in the Second Russian Civil War, and he would have been the one to take charge of the Russian Federation rather than Makarov, and that would have probably created a more stable ultranationalist faction, a mixture between Boris Gorshevsky's moderate policies and Makarov's extremism, where, while hostile against the West, Imran Zakhaev works with enough political mastery and subterfuge that he's able to ensure that Russia stays clear of an open conflict too quickly until it's ready to conquer Europe without American intervention, maybe by causing another civil war in another country that would force America's attention. And of course, even if he didn't achieve any of that, and that canonically he died very early on into the Modern Warfare timeline, his actions reverberated long after his demise. So for that reason, he is going right behind Palpatine and right above Velos. Because, technically he did succeed very briefly through Makarov, and, you know, what more can you say? I mean, for a villain, pretty impressive. Alright, guys, thank you all so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. I will be coming out with more videos, including another rant against another hero, which is coming up soon, and I'm very excited for this rant as well, because I have had a bone to pick with this hero for quite some time, and I really just want to see this motherfucker suffer and die and burn. But all that for another day. Until then, Darksiders, I bid you farewell. Also, I forgot to mention this in my other video recording, but Zakhaev was also immortalized as the hero of the Russian Federation in modern Russia during the Call of Duty Modern Warfare franchise. So, yeah, another big upgrade for his competency right there. But yeah.